Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's program, Restoring the Margin of Safety, the U.S. Navy in the 21st Century. I'm Roger Zackheim, Director of the Reagan Institute, the home of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute here in Washington, D.C. It's just a thrill to have all of you here, so many friends and supporters of the Reagan Foundation Institute, veterans of, I'll note, of the Reagan administration as well, in the room tonight. As many of you know, our mission at the Institute is to ensure President Reagan's timeless principles continue to inform our policy and scholarly work here in the nation's capital. The work of our centers for peace through strength, freedom, democracy, civics, education, and opportunity remain guided by President Reagan's warning that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Our fourth pillar, the Center for Scholarly Initiatives, is led by my colleague, Dr. Anthony Eames. Wave your hand there, Anthony. Get to know him. He's doing great work here, along with our key advisor and really the brainchild of our Center for Scholarly Initiatives, Professor Henry Now. Where's Henry? There we are. Our Center for Scholarly Initiatives cultivate a deeper understanding of President Reagan's effect on history, and we engage a rising generation of scholars and the academic community in the work of the Institute. And tonight is one example of the work of our Center for Scholarly Initiatives. And so in that spirit, I'm pleased that our partners from the International Security Studies program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy have joined us tonight for this timely discussion. In particular, I'd like to thank Professor Richard Schultz and our moderator for this evening, Professor Rocky White. Thank you for being here tonight and participating and joining with us in this program. Now, the Navy had a special place in President Reagan's heart. It was the set of the 1957 film Hellcats of the Navy, where he would meet his future wife and First Lady, Nancy. And Secretary Lehman, there you are. If deja vu is starting to set in, it's probably because of the December afternoon in 1982 where you spent with President Reagan aboard the USS New Jersey, where he shared his fond memories of filming Hellcats with the crew on board. Of course, there was more to the president's message that day. He rightly proclaimed, quote, that maritime superiority for the United States is a necessity, end quote. In Reagan's day, that required the buildup of a 600-ship Navy, the articulating a new maritime strategy, the bolstering, importantly, of Navy morale, and the integration of cutting-edge technology into the U.S. fleet at maximum cost effectiveness. Now tonight, the man that President Reagan turned to accomplish these and many other goals, Secretary Lehman, is here to recount the challenges to achieving maritime superiority the last time great power competition defined the state of global affairs. Secretary Lehman has rightly been called the most consequential Secretary of the Navy since World War II. And he didn't just lead the Navy, he was part of that Navy. In fact, that probably is one of the reasons why he was such a successful leader of that Navy. And also, having led numerous companies, he knows that having a strong commercial sector is vital to the innovation and the production that is required for the U.S. Navy to remain the leading maritime force in the world. And last, but certainly not least, Secretary Lehman is a profoundly good and wonderful person, an exceptional mentor. I'll reflect on that for just a moment. I was just telling him before him, it was about a decade ago where I joined with him on the Romney campaign, and it was a great campaign up until election night. Still a highlight for me, and I first met Secretary Lehman when he was in the Department of the Navy leading it. My father was over here tonight, of Zackheim. Also in the Reagan administration, I joined him on occasion to the office, and that's where I met John Lehman the first time, and more than a decade later, I found myself working with him on our defense team. And he never made me feel small, always actually made me feel quite big, and I'm grateful for that. A couple of highlights, just because I think about Secretary Lehman, and it's immediately I just have these images. First, the word bloat. I don't know if you look it up in the dictionary, but for him, The definition of bloat is the Defense Department bureaucracy. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. He said that all the time. Every time there's a dumb idea, let flowers bloom. Let them go. Everybody encouraging people to participate in the process on the campaign. I learned a lot in terms of how to lead and engage people. Oh yeah, and my favorite one. Just look at Title 10. All the authority is there. We just wish we had a leader who understood the authority and used the authority. And Secretary Lehman certainly did that during his time in the Department of Navy. And perhaps that's a message that should be heard in the Pentagon as well as the Congress. Just look at the authority. It's there. We just have to figure out how to use it. So, Mr. Secretary, it's a special honor tonight to have you here, to introduce you, for you tolerating me a decade ago and to continue to tolerate me through tonight, and grateful for all that you've taught me over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Secretary Lehman to the stage.
Happy to yield all my time to you.
The stage is yours, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here and to see so many good friends and even a good number of McCainiacs. Roger talking about the campaigns. It was so much fun traveling around with McCain on his two campaigns and having the honor to be with a couple of really first-class members of Congress today. Reminds me of when we had a few members that were traveling with us during the '08 campaign, and we hit over the Rockies some real turbulence. I mean, it was some of the most violent of all that either of us had experienced. And he and the two members were very, very, really nervous. And he got up and went over to them and said, "Don't worry, we are perfectly safe. I know I'm not going to die in a crash. I tried it 3 times, and but it is a pleasure to be here with people who have taken our national security so seriously. And many of you who have heard me speak both informally and with refreshing beverages or in a more formal setting know that there's almost no group so large that I can't reduce them all to despond and despair with. But since the Heritage Foundation has done that pretty well earlier this week, I think I can take a different tack, but it's a serious one and one that I believe. I have good news and I have bad news to talk about. The good news is people forget as we focus on the real security issues. They forget by stepping back and looking at a map what huge advantages we have. Just take a look at the geography. I mean, geopolitics are determinate, in my judgment. And here we sit with a 7,000-mile ocean protecting our whole eastern flank and a 3,000-mile ocean protecting our western flank. And we have north and south virtually all of the minerals, the resources that we can possibly need. But more importantly, we've got the culture that can work with these resources and build a technology constantly changing and innovating. There is no other culture in the world that can deal with the resources that they are blessed with and create more constant innovation and constant improvement. And yet we seem to forget this. We really have all the advantages in the world to start with. And so as we look at the problems we have and how to deal with them, don't lose sight of the fact that we should be basically very confident and optimistic, because short of a nuclear war, which is something certainly we can worry a lot about, we should never find ourselves really on the defensive. And we should build the changes that we need to make on that basis. Certainly the world, I don't think, is going to be coming back to the kind of free trade that we had over the last 2 decades for a long time. And we're the only power that doesn't need that kind of trade as much as the rest of and particularly our potential adversaries. So everything is really our advantage. And so we should be a little more confident when we talk about what we have to do and how we prioritize what needs to be done. Okay, that's the good news. But there's more good news. Let me just talk about our potential adversaries. China, I'm somewhat influenced by my former boss, Henry Kissinger, whom I had dinner with last night, and he's basically pretty optimistic because he still talks with them all the time, and they know that he is a transmission belt to American and European elites, but he's a pretty cold-hearted realist when it comes to the balance of power, and he has found a profound change in Chinese attitudes since the Ukraine, and that is one that they realize that no matter how much power, military power they build up, that projecting it over 7,000 miles of ocean is not something, let alone 100 miles across to Taiwan. And they have frequently, and Kissinger has written about the fact, the difference in perception of world politics between the Chinese and the Europeans and Americans is that we have spent our history and developed our lessons from fighting each other. Europe fought wars between the subpowers in the European continent for 1,500 years after the Roman Empire. The Chinese have never had to do that because they have controlled basically the Asian landmass, and had a unified government, except that they have had to build their state around many different ethnic groups, and so their principal concern is not external threats from powers on their borders, but keeping stability in this huge mass of humanity. And they're coming to realize, they've realized that the injection of free market enterprise has built their economy to a point where there are now hundreds of different sub-centers of power. And that is what is giving them increasing concern and why they're turning back to communism. And they know that they're giving up economic growth, that this is a major change to do what they're doing, centralizing, turning more of the economy over to the state-owned enterprise. They know that will shrink their economy, but it will give the party the power once again that they had in Mao's time to control the economy, and they're willing to accept the sacrifices of revenue and that goes along with it. Okay, turning to our other principal adversary, as John McCain said, the gas station with an economy the size of Denmark. There is, I think, a really serious worry. I think that Putin is finished. No matter what he does now, he's finished. It's only a question of how he goes. And so it brings many good things for us. It brings a much strengthened and realistic European community that we are already rebuilding their military deterrence. And it brings a great reduction in the potential threat among our allies in Europe. But it could go too far. If Russia descends into chaos, it depends on what happens after Putin. Because, Putin, his strength is an authoritarian strongman, a true fascist. But a true strongman can't be seen as weak. And he's now proved that he is weak. And no matter what he does, it's not going to restore his ability. But what takes its place? And he certainly has reduced the strength and the ability to dominate neighbors. And as far as rebuilding a buffer zone of states from the former Soviet Union, he can forget about that for a good while. So there's lots of good news there, but there are new threats that come from that. So back to the bad news. The bad news is that we have really allowed our defenses to wither so much that we have brought about what we are seeing, the disasters around the world, the encouragement of the disturbers of the peace, because they think we are simply not deterring them anymore. They have watched us disarm. We continue to disarm. Even as we spend more money, we get less and less for it. And we now have a Navy that goes back to the Carter administration and the discredited swing strategy. The only thing you can say about our Navy is that if there's fighting that breaks out and the need for naval power in the Pacific, that we'll have to empty out the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf to produce the kind of naval superiority that you can with the 270-ship Navy. Or the reverse, if you empty out the Pacific. Well, obviously, just as it was rejected in the Carter days, it is absurd to even talk about it today. Yet, that's what we are producing. And when you have an administration, as we did this year, propose to early retire 30 ships from a too small Navy, this is a serious issue that we have to deal with. The Navy is not selling itself. It's not producing the strategy and the ability to articulate the strategy that is necessary in a democracy to have the people and their representatives in Congress support a kind of expenditure that is necessary to build and maintain it. The situation today in the Navy is the worst I've ever seen it. And I can't blame one man or woman for this. This is the result of 30 years of very weak leadership. And through Republican and Democratic administrations. And so we really do have to rebuild the bipartisan consensus that we must have naval superiority. Without it, the good things that I talked about are going to tempt the disturbers of the peace back into aggression that can threaten us all. So we are underfunding certainly the Air Force and the Navy, and especially the Navy, obviously. Today, in a global world, the Navy is the primary platform. The Air Force is certainly an essential platform where you have the average pilot is younger than the average fighter plane that he flies. And this is absurd. Yet we have the same situation in the Navy. So all is not roses. I think the mega scene is optimistic. We have the whole cards, but we are not doing what is necessary to play out the good hand that we have. And so that's why the focus of today's meeting, I think, is so timely. And I think you're going to hear a lot of good thinking and proposals about what we should do about the bad news. Otherwise, we're going to waste the good news. Thank you.
So we all sit. Yeah. Yeah. So Secretary, you're here. Okay. And then Senator? Okay. Yeah. Okay, here we go. I'm Rocky Whites. I'm Director of Maritime Studies at the Fletcher School. I want to thank the Reagan Institute for hosting. Great to see a lot of friends in the room. Thank you, Secretary, for the introductory remarks. As you can see, we have a lot to talk about. Secretary Lehman needs no introduction, so I'm going to keep moving forward here. So Senator Roger Wicker has represented Mississippi in the U.S. Senate since December of 2007. During his time in the Senate, Wicker has championed pro-growth policies to create jobs, limit federal overreach, protect life, and maintain a strong national defense. Wicker is the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation for the 117th Congress. Wicker is the second highest ranking Republican member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. His other committee assignments include Environment and Public Works Committee and Rules Administration Committee. He's the co-chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission and vice president of the OECE's Parliamentary Assembly. He also serves as a member of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy's Congressional Board of Visitors, and he is famous for authoring the Securing the Homeland by Increasing Our Power on the Seas Act, the SHIPS Act, which was signed into law by President Trump as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. Congresswoman Elaine Luria represents Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. Prior to her election in 2018, Representative Luria served 2 decades in the Navy, retiring at the rank of commander. She served at sea on 6 ships as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, deployed to the Middle East and Western Pacific, and culminated her Navy career by commanding a combat-ready unit of 400 sailors. Vice Chair of the House Armed Services Committee and a member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, Representative Luria was one of the first women in the Navy's nuclear power program and among the first women to serve the entirety of her career in combatant ships. She serves on the House Armed Services Committee, where she's the committee's vice chair, the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, where she serves as the chair of the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Subcommittee, and the House Committee on Homeland Security. Of all members of the House Democratic Congress, she has served the longest on active duty, having completed 20 years of active military service in the Navy. She graduated from the Naval Academy and received a master's in engineering management from Old Dominion University. So, we have introductory remarks, I think, from Senator Wicker and then Representative Luria. Or I have questions ready. But I want to give the floor because we have Secretary Lehman give us much to think about and discuss. So over to you, Senator.
Okay, well, so am I on here? All right. And let me say, we weren't expecting to be in town, except I had scheduled a fundraiser down the street, and Chuck Grassley had scheduled a fundraiser, so Gail and I are back in town. I did one of these overseas in Switzerland, and my wife, who's here, and is the brains of the outfit, she was mortified that my socks didn't come all the way up, and I had exposed legs. So I'm feeling better already.
Good job.
About this. You know, I am neither rich nor famous, but if I have to be famous for something, I'm happy to be famous for being the author of the SHIPS Act. And, you know, Mr. Secretary, I'm sure when Reagan was president and he decided we were going to beef up our defense and win the Cold War, I'm sure he didn't know all the details, but he listened to the admirals and generals and people that he respected, including very good veterans who had moved on to the administration. My view on the SHIPS Act is occasionally, periodically, the admirals and generals do a survey around the world, and they come back and they draft a requirements statement, and the Congress looks at the requirement statement and they never quite get there. So when I became chairman of Sea Power, it seemed to me that we ought to do something to try to actually make that requirement have some teeth, and maybe we should put it in law. So that's what we did. And Mr. Secretary came to testify before my Sea Power subcommittee. We had a series of hearings about whether we should put 355 ships in the statute. And I'll be honest with you, the first hearing we had was classified. And the people who came from the Department of the Navy and the Marine Corps were so ill-prepared to advocate for more ships, I was glad it was classified. I was glad the public didn't hear. And really, I think some of the staff around were mortified. So the next few hearings we had, which included Secretary Lehman and others, told us about how it was done during the Reagan administration. We passed the SHIPS Act. 355 ships is the law of the land, but as many of you know, you've got to have an authorization and you've got to have an appropriation. We didn't get there. We got over 300 during Trump, and we've fallen back. We'll discuss how to get way past 355 during the course of this little panel. But one thing we need to decide as policymakers is that we are the elected representatives of the people, and the administration is the elected they are the elected executive branch. But the bureaucrats in the Office of Management and Budget are not the people that ought to call the shots on this. And that's exactly what we found ourselves with. We were throwing trillions at COVID and how we were going to come out of COVID. And it seemed to me maybe putting some money, Mr. Secretary, in supply chain so that as soon as the pandemic was over, we get started building some Stingers and Javelins and all of these acronyms that TACMs that we talk about now needing. We could get started with that. And Donald Trump's own OMB vetoed that. Told the negotiators, Jim Inhofe, and Jack Reed, that we couldn't do that. And so if we are going to do what we need to do, if we are going to solve this problem, which the Rand Corporation said is a problem, and which Heritage Foundation in the assessment, annual assessment yesterday said is a grave problem. We have gone from marginal, and I don't know what you've said because I had to be down the street. You probably talked about this, Mr. Secretary, but we went from marginal to weak. Rand Corporation studied this, studied a Pacific war, and said we would lose that war. Now, when I was a boy, coming out of the Air Force Reserve and joining Congress in 1995, our policy was we win 2 major theater wars at the same time. You don't do that by draining ships from the Pacific and sending them to the Atlantic, or that other scenario that's more likely. I mean, we got way away from that because we were not willing to make the tough decisions and spend the 8% of GDP and on down to 5%, which was sensible under Reagan. And we need absolutely a bipartisan solution, but it needs to be emphatic, it needs to be real, and it needs to be it needs to be bought into by the American public.
Okay, thank you so much. Congresswoman Luria?
Well, I want to say thank you for having me and allowing me to join this conversation. It's great to be back with you, Senator Wicker. I know we've had a chance to sit on the stage and talk about the future of the Navy together in the past, and Secretary Lehman as well for your leadership and vision over many decades. And as I've come to Congress and now gone through my 4th NDAA cycle of writing the defense bill, 2 under each administration, there's been a clear and obvious lack of a strategy. And I think Secretary Lehman and the legacy of the 1980s maritime strategy is something that I've looked back to in a sense of how could we replicate that today and be able to clearly articulate the needs of the nation for the Navy that we need in order to promote our priorities around the world. And when we see the increased aggression of China against Taiwan, Ukraine's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, all of the demands that we have in the world, it makes no sense, as the senator said, that they send over a budget where they want to decommission 24 ships and only build 8. And then it's on us to take that round turn, to increase the number of ships, to stop decommissionings. And I think we'll get into the conversation about what do we have as a vision of the future of the Navy. But the truth is, as Congress, I find that one of the things that's never articulated to us, and I'll take a step back because the Navy is a deterrent force. And it's really hard to measure the effectiveness of deterrence. So it's really hard, I find, for Navy leadership to come to Congress and sell how we create a deterrent force and why it's worth that cost to the American public. And when we're presented with these plans, and since I've been in Congress, some years we've had no 30-year shipbuilding plan. When we have had one, for example, Battle Force 2045, I might not have agreed with every aspect of the composition of that plan, but it did grow the fleet. It came so late in the administration that we really had no opportunity to take that and work and enact it and try to get closer to that 355, of which 11 carriers, goal that is part of law. And it's never articulated what the risk is of not doing something. And so I've gone in a little free time back on YouTube, watched some of the hearings from, say, 1986, where you were testifying before the Senate. And that was one of the things that was clearly articulated in the maritime strategy of the 1980s. Here's what we need. Here's why we need it. Adds up to 15 carrier battle groups. But let me tell you, Congress, this is the risk of not doing it. And without that clear articulation of that, it's hard for those of us who don't really work these issues day in and out to convince the rest of Congress, the American public, why this is such an important investment of our taxpayer dollars. And clearly, we have the largest defense budget in history this year. We added $37 billion. The Senate added $45 billion over the request. We'll get somewhere in the middle of that. And we make a modest additional investment in shipbuilding, authorizing 15 DDGs, stopping the decommissioning of some of the cruisers and LSDs, minimum number of amphibs, but we're not really getting where we need to be. So I'm glad to have this discussion tonight and be able to show that this is bipartisan and bicameral. And we really are looking for the right kind of information to come to Congress so that we can effectively get to where we need to be with our Navy as a deterrent.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I have 3 questions for the group, and then we're going to open it up, so start thinking. There's lots to discuss. So first, given the current geopolitical environment, Does America need a 600-ship Navy or perhaps larger? Secretary Lehman?
No, I don't think we need that number. I think a 355 ship Navy, along with the unmanned underwater and the new technology. I mean, the terminal guidance has moved so far beyond what we had back in that day that that changes the equation significantly. But we do have to have a presence, and if you're not there, you're not there. And
Right.
And deterrence, visual deterrence, is important. The battleships made a huge contribution to our overall strategy, but they fitted into a strategy. And the senator and the congressman are exactly right. There is no strategy right now articulated. And the worst of all is in the uniformed Navy. There is no explanation of why you want more. Well, because we want more. And nobody can articulate a clear strategy of how it deters what they're going to build is going to reestablish the deterrence of our adversaries from doing bad things. There's no, it's just, and worse than that, and this was really the situation when Reagan came in. The services were all sort of, their strategy was, well, what they could get through OMB and get through OSD. That was the strategy. And when I first explained to, and Peter was there, first explained what we were going to do, the admirals were very negative on it because they said, you'll never get that. You can't go up to Congress and ask for a 15% increase in the Navy budget. And so that's why we think you should come up, you should ask for this. And it was just so unrealistic and so disappointing to the bipartisan. I mean, we really did have a bipartisan consensus on the Hill, and I think we have the same today. We really have leadership in both parties on the Hill for doing something and doing what needs to be done to reestablish deterrence. So I think it can be done, but it's going to take leadership to do it.
Yeah. Thank you. Senator?
Well, we've seen that bad guys still do really terrible things in this modern year of 2022. I've been wearing this flag since February 24th. It's a friendship flag between Ukraine and the United States. And I think a lot of people just never thought we would get to this stage again. I know we had, back in the mid-90s, we had the Balkans, and it was terrible, the carnage there. But that was Yugoslavia spinning out of control. This is one signatory member of the OSCE deciding to violate every principle that they've agreed to as nations, and invading a sovereign nation, actually Georgia and Ukraine. And this time doing it in such a way that I think we ought to all know that this can happen. If it can happen in Europe, that we just had 70 years of a new world order respecting those sorts of boundaries, then it can happen in the Pacific. And Representative Luria is correct. This is what I would like to do, and maybe it's more than 355 ships. But I would have listened to the expert. But what we need to do is beef up our Navy and the rest of DOD so we can avoid conflict in the Pacific. If you want peace between Taiwan and China, then we spend the money to make sure nobody tries it. Somehow, Putin thought he could try it. He's been embarrassed. He's still very dangerous. But the case needs to be made, and if the secretary says 355 ships is still it, I'll accept that, because I think we ought to listen to the people that do this every day and get the reports back. So I'll kick it to you and maybe make another point.
Well, I do think we're on a dangerous trajectory. I put together some numbers and projections in an article recently about the loss of the number of VLS cells that we're going to have over the next several years. And if you listen to Admiral Davidson and then Admiral Aquilino testified before the Senate last year saying, it's very likely that China could try to take Taiwan by force in the next 6 years. That's now 5 years. We're going to lose about 1,680 VLS cells in that time frame, and 1,980 between now and 2035. That's more than all European navies combined. And when we look at that capability, that's a capability for long-range strike. When we look at the capability just for presence and deterrence throughout the Pacific and all the different regions in the world, we're very stressed. And the number 355, it's very ambitious. It would take us decades to actually get to 355. And at the point that we're seeing these budgets come over and we're continuing seeing decreases in the numbers, we're coming to the point where we're going to be within the first phase of the Arleigh Burkes coming to the end of their life cycle. And I'm really pushing the Navy to say, what is your plan for modernization, for upgrades, extending the service life? Even several of the cruisers that we in the House version of the NDAA, and I believe you did in the Senate this year as well, said thou shalt not decommission these. The Navy, because of the way their process works, actually back in February stopped modernization on 2 ships that were in the middle of a long-term overhaul that was going to extend their service life. So they essentially make these decisions before it comes to Congress to essentially authorize or stop the process. So the Navy is set on a trajectory that they're going to have to get smaller because they're constrained by costs. And the price and complexity of every platform that's being built or planned to be built is going up. I just saw an estimate recently that the next large surface combatant could top $4 billion per platform. Yet on the other hand, the Marine Corps is requesting very inexpensive capabilities to increase their capacity throughout the Pacific, and that's not moving forward at the rate that we would like to see. But I think it all goes back to the question of the strategy. Without a strategy, how is anyone justifying 355 or any other number? And the Navy has done the Navy, some independent think tanks have done, since I've been in Congress, at least 5, maybe 6, 7 of these studies about the right sizing of the Navy. And I see many people in this room who've been involved in those. I think we can all agree that bigger is what we need. The exact composition, there's flexibility in that, but we need to tailor it towards our most pressing threat, which is providing a deterrent in the Pacific and deterring the Chinese trying to take Taiwan by force.
I'm not sure it would take decades. When I hear
I hope
decades,
not.
that's 20 years. That's just a plural. If we changed our mindset and decided we needed to do it to prevent a war, we could certainly do that as this country has risen to the occasion before. In terms of the requirement, this last estimate we got was a bunch of choices, and basically if you're only willing to spend X, then a smaller number of ships is our requirement. We need to be told what we need, what the requirement is to keep the peace and make sure we always win. But we were given 3 choices, and the lowball thing, unless we collectively help the American people make a decision that this is serious, that will leave us in a real position of weakness.
We found in the Reagan administration that we got 90% of the benefit of the 600-ship Navy in about 6 months after it became clear that Reagan was serious about it and Congress was serious about it. First, he set up right away a budget amendment, and then a new budget for the coming year. There was a 20% increase. And then he made speech after speech to say, we will reestablish maritime superiority. I never was much of a linguist, but he kept using supremacy or superiority. I don't know what the difference is, but
They're both good.
they're both good. They're both more better than what we have. But the reality is, if we declared as a nation and Congress supported, we are going to build 355 ships, and that will reestablish maritime superiority, and we will be able to carry out what our strategy requires, and that is to win if attacked and to prevent war above all. It needn't be complex. It shouldn't be complex. It should be straightforward logic. And that will bring, not 2 decades from now, but it will bring within a year the deterrence that you need, because people have to calculate you are going to do that. And they also know the record. If we are challenged, our American industrial base can do incredible things. Incredible things.
And you get a twofer.
And you get a twofer.
You get safer and you get jobs.
Yeah, exactly,
And
right.
I've said this several decades is because the commitments have been so variable and fluctuating. And, Senator coming from Mississippi, and with Pascagoula shipbuilding there, we build all the carriers and half the submarines in Virginia, Maine, the key shipbuilding centers in this country. When industry hears a message that changes every year, I say sometimes if you have a 30-year shipbuilding plan that changes years 1 to 5, change every year, there's no consistency. There's no real clear message from the top to make that investment in the workforce, in the industrial base, and it has to come from the top. In the Reagan administration, it came from the top. I think in the previous administration, the Trump administration, there was a vision, but the plan didn't come out until too late, essentially September in the last year of the term, and it's really lacking in this administration. And what's truly lacking is a sense of urgency. When you hear Aquilino, Davidson, and even Secretary Blinken has now really reiterated without a precise timeline that, there's a sense of urgency here that's not getting conveyed to the Pentagon. It's not getting conveyed in the budgets that come over to us, and it's certainly not being reiterated from the top and from the White House, from the administration, to say that this is an investment we have to make. You can't say it's too expensive to make. It's actually too expensive not to make.
Yes.
That might sound cliche, but the truth is, I look at all these things we do in Congress as members of the House. If we don't get this right, as far as deterrence with regards to China, deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, everything else we do is really not going to matter if we don't get this part right, because we're looking at whose values are going to control the rest of the 21st century. Is it the United States and our allies, or is it China? And we have to have a Navy for that deterrent purpose.
But there are 2 big obstacles that Congress has initiated some action on, but the executive branch, through several administrations, has done nothing about. One is we are disarming through the irrational procurement system that we have in the Pentagon. It's a nonsensical, bureaucratic, monopolistic system that, for instance, the newest carrier costs 3 times, adjusted for inflation, what the last Nimitz class cost.
Right.
Because there's no competition. There's no pressure for cost control. We're dealing, what we call competition is really holding beauty contests to award 50-year monopolies. There's no pressure for innovation, for cost control, and it plagues all of the Pentagon's procurement. They hate competition, and they call it congressional micromanagement when the Congress, where the committees rightly, as in the NDAAs that were passed during McCain's period, by, again, bipartisan, almost unanimity in your committees, gave the executive branch the tools to start getting competition and start getting cost control into it, ignored by the bureaucracy. There are, people forget that in the 1947 Act that established the Pentagon, by law, the the Office of the Secretary of Defense was limited to 50 civilians. That's in the law. That number today is 750,000 FTEs.
Wow.
And so moving the bureaucracy is a whole separate issue. But at least to recognize the problem, that we are disarming ourselves. As we spend more money, we get less and less and less. And we've got to change that system. The other problem is jointness. We've turned into a religion, the common sense that was behind some of Goldwater Nichols. Now everything has to be joint. Every captain or colonel has to spend 4 years of staff duty in order to be considered for promotion to flag. And that's why we created from 7, when the law was passed, 7 JTFs, Joint Task Forces. We now have 257 because we had to provide all these places to read newspapers for the people that get their staff duty in time. So those are two problems we've got to deal with. You know, every service and every bureaucracy in the Pentagon had a say in the 12 different technologies they wanted to stuff into the new aircraft carrier, into the new Zumwalt destroyer, into the LCS. Joint committees, so everybody had their say. And who got fired? Can anybody remember the name of anybody that got fired for anything since we adopted that system, or got promoted for doing a great job bringing a program in? So those are two huge changes. Congress has articulated this, but nothing has happened.
Well, and I think what you're saying is there's got to be something more than a statute. Right. And I don't know that there are enough hours in a year for congressional oversight over something that big.
You're right.
So it's got to be departmental, and it needs to come from the very top, the commander-in-chief, actually.
But, you know, I was, and many in here in this room were in the transition from Carter to Reagan. And the Armed Services Committees in both houses were a part of that transition because they put the pressure on during the transition to pick people that knew what they were doing and to accomplish some specific things that Congress had already put into law. So I think there still is a role beyond just the legislating role that the committees have, particularly committees like your two committees. You have people that it's hard to match the expertise of the members like two president, if I can just blow a little smoke, that can really have an influence, and you shouldn't shrink from it.
All right, I'm going to do one thing here. So I think important in any Navy conversation is a little course correction. So I'm going to merge my two questions into just one, and it's more relevant to this conversation. And then we're going to open it up to all of you because there's a lot here on the table. So the Coast Guard has started building ships with long-term planning, and their offshore patrol cutter is at $65 million a hull to produce. And some research I've been doing at the Fletcher School is on the idea of a modern PT boat. And I found this entrepreneur in Texas who can produce one for $40 million, about 100 feet long, dash speed of 50 knots, heavily armed, and you can put Navy strike missiles on it. And the question is, when you do the math, for one Ford-class carrier, you could get 250 of these. And so how is a more global Coast Guard that can operate in contested waters and a modern PT boat that could operate with anti-ship missiles also in places like the South China Sea, how could that fit into the question that was kind of kicking around here is how can we get more ships faster, as fast as possible, so we have the presence and the deterrence? And what role does the Coast Guard play in that? So take it away. Secretary?
Well, first, the Coast Guard, as you know, in times of conflict, becomes part of the Navy. But it's part of the Navy anyway, and they do deploy but, you know, the way the United States Navy has to operate, it's over long distances across a 7,000-mile sea.
Understood.
And also, they have to be in combat, close combat often, and they have to be able to deal with missiles. Coast Guard, even their biggest ships, are fine ships for what they have to do.
Right.
But they are not compartmentalized. They don't have the infrastructure and power to have the kind of defenses and offenses that you need to be deployers. So they can't carry a role, say, as a frigate, even though they have some ships that are as big as or bigger than World War II destroyers. They just are built for a different purpose, but the Navy can certainly integrate them in, and they are force enhancers without question. As to the PT boats or the smaller combatants, the problem is, just like the LCS, you can't deploy. They're good for coastal operations, particularly if not against a particular well-armed and certainly not air superior force. So I think it would be, frankly, a waste of money.
Okay.
Because those little ships can't go far without refueling, and they can't carry ammunition, and they can't be armored, and they can't be compartmentalized to actually fight. They're limited role for them in stinging, the way they were used in World War II.
Mosquito.
Just a mosquito, and I wouldn't call it a fleet. I'd have a few.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Senator, and then
What,
Congressman.
what can I possibly add to that?
Okay. All right. Well.
I yield back.
Yeah. Okay. There we go, Congresswoman. Yeah.
No, I think I have a slightly different view. I think their quantity has a quality of its own.
Yes.
And when you look at the model of the Marine Corps, when we look at the EABO, Commandant Berger's vision of using the Marine
Yes.
Corps in a dispersed manner, naval
That's
strike
right.
missiles, the laws, light amphibious warship, which unfortunately the Navy's pushed back again. We wanted to authorize that this year.
Yep.
But also smaller vessels, craft, whether they're operated by the Navy, the Marine Corps, even the Army, because people always joke that the Army has a bigger
Transco.
fleet than the Navy,
Yeah.
and or the Coast Guard, that ability to have a dispersed fleet to make the problem more complex within, essentially the first island chain.
Yeah.
I think part of our problem in the fact that every platform has gotten so much more expensive, and we're looking at $4 billion for the next large surface combatant, is the Navy really doesn't do well with small, inexpensive. I hate to say it, but in some degree, expendable.
Right.
They think that expendable now needs to be unmanned, which becomes
Right.
expensive 20 years in the future, technology we don't have. And I do think that there is a role in all of the sea surfaces, all of the above, for smaller craft that can operate in a more dispersed manner, but actually have firepower. Even when we have had smaller craft in our sea surfaces, we haven't put anything sort of equivalent to the naval strike missile or
That's right.
long-range strike on those platforms. And I know that, based off of one of the many plans we've seen from the Navy over the last few years, that was a component that has been included in several of those plans. So I would be supportive of that. But again, every time the Navy has done small, the Navy has immediately abandoned small because they feel like if they have limited resources, that's not within their best use of resources, of both personnel and financial resources.
Excellent. Yeah. Good. Contrasting views. Okay. Yes. Introduce yourself and end with a question. Okay.
Deb Zackheim, father of Roger.
Okay. Very good. You have the floor.
Not your fault.
No, I know. I know the clan.
A quick Reagan story, actually an abridged one that'll tell you the power of Mr. Lehman, and then a question.
Okay.
The Reagan story is, at one point, I'm sitting in the White House meeting. I was probably the most junior guy there. And Reagan is apprised of the fact that OSD and OMB have issues with the 15 carrier, 600 ship Navy. And Jeane Kirkpatrick was speaking, and the president interrupts her and says, I happen to support 15 carriers, 600 ships. Does anybody disagree with me? We don't have that kind of leadership today. The question is this, John, you've written an excellent book that suggests that maybe we could do with smaller carriers and more of them. Maybe you want to expand on that, and then I'd be very interested to hear what the senator and the congresswoman think about that.
I'd be happy to answer it, but I would request the two members to close their ears. Because I really believe that we managed in the Reagan administration the sole source of Newport News pretty well. We gave them real incentives to get the costs down and innovation in manufacturing and so forth. All that's been abandoned. And so there is no cost control, really. It's not their fault, but it's their fault. Where is Steve Wills? Steve Wills and I did a little book that recommended that we go back to a carrier about the size of what the French are doing, about 65,000 tons, which can be built in 4 different yards, including 2 owned by Newport News, but that would bring competition back in. And we recommended conventional, but it could just also be using, well, that gets into more of a complex issue, but using nuclear power, just as a little more expensive. Anyway, that would give us pretty much the size of the current Nimitz air wing, and would enable competition. We could still have 1,000 watertight compartments, which are essential, 3 armored decks, triple keels, and 35 knots. And they'd be a fraction of the cost of the sole source Ford class. So, yes, small is better. And I might say that what the Marine Corps is recommending is exactly the kind of ship we should be building. I agree with the Congresswoman. And I think not enough has been said tonight about General Berger's insight. He is exactly on the right strategy. Obviously it's got problems and issues and so forth, but to rebuild the Marine Corps into the kind of agile and yet hard-hitting force that is dispersible. There are 50,000 islands in the Pacific, 50,000. And many of them, if not most of them, can certainly be used as temporary bases. And the Marine Corps with the Navy, if the Navy doesn't build the ships and support the concept, it's not going to happen. But General Berger sees the right strategy that the Navy should be adopting. Fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Yes. And then get out and move on, because the vulnerabilities of our principal adversary are precisely those that can't be dealt, with in the old Marine Corps. Shipping 70-ton tanks across 7,000 miles to engage in a huge battle is not the way to go. So there is a role for ships small as 65,000 tons, and the 10,000-ton ships that the Marine Corps wants and should have. And they can be built in a lot of different yards that can really revivify our industrial base.
Can I ask, I'm a panelist, but let me...
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you still subscribe to the recommendation you made in that book? And after all the agony of the Ford, what's the future of that class?
Well, the future of the class has been predetermined because Congress has appropriated the money for 4 of them. And so far, there's no indication that the Kennedy will be any cheaper than the Ford. And I
Who in
would,
here would you put in charge to correct that?
well, I see several. I don't want to hurt any feelings, but I can see right in the front row, half a dozen of them that.
I think they charge by the hour now.
That's right. It would still be a lot cheaper.
Any comments?
So it's interesting, we're talking about, the Ford class, as the Ford is now on its maiden employment. It's not truly a deployment.
Right.
And, being very familiar with what happens in our backyard here at Newport News, for example, I at one point made a quote that the Ford was a $13 billion nuclear-powered birthing barge, because that's really what it was for some period of time as they came through really the challenges that they had with implementing 4 new technologies, the dual band radar, catapults, arresting gear, and the weapons elevators without prototyping them. And those were decisions that were actually made decades ago and led to complexities in the construction. I do have a level of confidence that in the construction of the Kennedy and future Ford-class carriers, that some of the delays that we've seen, because now we are seeing the Ford deploy 6 years late from its initial deployment schedule, that we won't see those specific delays. But I do know from their current underway operations right now that there continue to be challenges with those systems. I do think that there is a role for a smaller platform than Nimitz or Ford class carriers in order for doing air operations. And I think with the advances in unmanned aerial vehicles, that there is the possibility to leverage some of the platforms we have that you built in Mississippi. I mean, we saw this year they wanted to move LHA-10 out 5 additional years. We've fought the fight over the Marine Corps and the minimum number of amphibs, but we have seen creative employment of the ships that we do have, LHAs, LHDs, with a modified air wing, Marine Corps assets, vertical launched, fixed wing aircraft. And so I think that, like I said a little while ago, if this happens in the next 5 years, we have to fight with what we have. So I do think that the Marine Corps has been creative in working with the Navy to use some of the platforms that we have today in order to leverage that. And, a further issue with this is on the repair side.
Oh, huge.
Because we also have
Yes.
Norfolk Naval Shipyard, one of the
thank you
4
for raising
public shipyards, is that, at the point where we were passing through decommissioning of the last conventional carrier, we relied on less shipyards, less capability, but all nuclear, and only 4 public shipyards to maintain all of our carriers, at the time 12, now down to 11. And we haven't made sufficient investments in upgrading, modernizing, and increasing capacity in those shipyards as we now build additional Virginia-class submarines. So not only are we not, I think, building enough of the platforms we need, we're not getting as much ACE of O operational availability out of those platforms.
True.
And I won't get too into the weeds on this, but when the first carrier deployment I did the first deployment on Truman in 2000. We were on the 6 out of every 24-month cycle. So 6 months deploy, in that was the workups, the maintenance period, and repeat. And pretty much all ships in the Navy worked on that cycle. Forward deployed more frequently. But now, the Navy says they're on 6 out of 36. Truly, I think the numbers show they're on 6 out of 42. As taxpayers, are we getting really the right amount of on-station time out of these carriers that we're investing $13 billion in? So I think on our end, we need to be looking at the tail. Like, where are those investments? Because we need more investments in the shipyards, both public and private, in order to actually get the full utility out of the platforms that we've invested in for a set service life. So, yeah.
Great comments. Thank you. Yes, Brent. Hey. Yeah, that's good for the online people. Yes, thank you.
So Brent Souther from Heritage Foundation. Again, thank you for the comments about the index release.
Yeah.
Yesterday, it's been nonstop. So again, thank you. Whether you like it or hate it, thank you for reading it. So I wanted to segue, Representative Luria, on your comment about the maintenance and the tail of this. And it's a serious question.
Yeah.
And I think the BRAC commissions cut too far. They went beyond meat and fat. They actually cut into bone. And as the nuclear submarine force and the nuclear carrier force is key in a competition and a fight with China that's going to grow, it's clear it's not at the capacity it needs to be. So doesn't that argue for a 5th public shipyard? And maybe it needs to be more than just nuclear maintenance. It needs to also incorporate some new innovation for like unmanned systems in order to be sustainable and viable. I'd be interested in your reactions, and obviously, Secretary Lehman, your thoughts on that as well.
Thank you. Okay, Congresswoman, why don't you start off, and then we'll end with,
Okay, well.
unless you want to punt it, it's fine.
I certainly don't, but I
Yeah.
don't want to monopolize. I
Yeah.
mean, representing a district in Hampton Roads where we do 1/4 of the shipbuilding and repair in the entire country. It's certainly a pertinent issue
Yes.
for us, and then Norfolk Naval Shipyard obviously being in Portsmouth, Virginia. The shipyards, the public shipyards we have are aging. They don't have, significant, enough capacity, certainly not for the growing submarine fleet, and I do think we need to look at increasing that capacity. I, have not seen a realistic proposal for implementation of a physical 5th yard versus expansion of capacity in the yards we have, or expansion of capacity within the public-private partnerships we have, in the sense that, we have started doing repair availabilities at the builders' yards. That went really poorly, and everyone admits that at the beginning, and I went to the, president of, our local builder at Newport News, and I said, well, you built it, how come you can't fix it, repair it? And there is a different, organization set up, process for doing repair, but I think that has increased in its efficiency and productivity. But again, when we want to build more Virginia-class submarines, we have to keep the Columbia-class on track, and I probably sound like a broken record on this, but the Columbia-class is the #1 priority of the Department of Defense. Nuclear deterrent remains the cornerstone of our national defense. We have to keep that on track. So if we're asking the builders' yards, both Electric Boat and Newport News, to do more repair, that's taking away from their capacity to build. So I do think that increased capacity on the nuclear side is essential. I just haven't, in Congress, no one's come to us since I've been in Congress and said, here's a real proposal where that investment could be, and how we would carry that out.
Your argument would be that a new repair yard would be so innovative and so much more up to date that it would be a model rather than expanding the 4 existing ones.
I just don't see it, to Congresswoman Lurie's point, I just don't see any way that Navy, while they're going through the SIA, which is now clearly under financed and planned, that you can do all those modifications and modernizations at the same time that the demand, both on the shipbuilder and on those public shipyards, is going up. That you can do that with basically the footprint that you have. Maybe you might expand a little bit outside the gates on those 4. It just seems that you have to have a 5th yard to do the nuclear maintenance that you need right now and in the immediate future. But at the same time, you can't just do nuclear maintenance. You can't just do nuclear life cycle work at this 5th yard if you were to get that. You'd also have to do new things with the unmanned, because that's clearly a significant critical part for the future.
Opportunity.
So you have to look at it different. If you're going to build a new 5th yard, or go back to where we were in the Cold War and look at resurrecting one out of the past, it can't just be it just can't be a replication of, it can't be a replication of Nokoa and Hawaii. It has to be something different, as well as additive to nuclear weapons.
I'm going to intercede before you start, only to say we got the 5-minute mark. So, Secretary and Senator, try to split the 5 minutes amicably.
I yield you 5 minutes.
He's a pro.
2.5, yeah.
There's a combination that can work. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard has 2 of the best graving docks still operational. Some of them across the river where the Kitty Hawk was built, just directly across the river in the New York Shipbuilding Yard, have been changed to other things. But you could, I would recommend bringing Aker, who already builds profitable ships in that yard, into a GOCO situation where it's government-owned and government-supervised, but contractor-operated. And Aker has brought all sorts of the latest technologies. You've got now companies that have the latest technology, as good as anything in Asia, in Fincantieri, building our new frigate, that could bring that kind of expertise into yards like NASCO, which has can build a 75,000-ton ship, into resurrecting the old what's the name of it in the Mississippi, right north of
Are you thinking, you're saying
Avondale.
Louisiana?
Yeah, I won't pursue that. But there are.
It is, yes.
Yeah, there are options, combination of, first, I would, every time I used to go through a naval shipyard, it was like going through a museum. You couldn't see any computer-controlled machining. It's stuff that you saw in pictures of the Industrial Revolution in England. And it's literally true, particularly in Hawaii. I mean, Hawaii is still a museum. I mean, it's, so we should be investing in the public yards that we do own and modernizing them and bringing in innovation. I think it's very doable to significantly expand our repair first and easily, and then construction, because Philadelphia and the other yards built nuclear submarines while they were repairing and overhauling carriers and so forth. So we can go back to that. We need the leadership. 5 minutes is over.
Well, with that, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. This was phenomenal.
Thank you.
And thank you again to the Reagan Institute for hosting. This was just a fabulous
Yeah.
event. So thank you, everybody. Everyone is released. Yeah.